Welcome back, everybody. It's been about a 4-year hiatus since the last time I posted a video, but recently in my class, I've been talking a little bit about data modeling and databases, and I thought it would be really useful to do a video on data modeling and SQLAlchemy, because I think there's a lot of utility in being able to create your own database for a project that you're working on. Now, as I have told my students, this is not something that's always really necessary. I think for the vast majority of projects, you're never going to get to a point where your data is so complex that it really actually needs a database. But I've been working on digital corpora for a long time, and I've been collecting texts from all over the internet. And as I do this, I've also been building out a spreadsheet of metadata that describes these texts. And that spreadsheet, as it exists now, is a little bit of a mess. As you can see here in this spreadsheet, I have a collection of information that has information like, here is a local ID for my texts. Here is the title of the document. Here's its genre, some subcategory information, authorship, when it was written, and these kinds of things, where I found it on the internet, and all of that. And that's fine. And it's not really necessary to move beyond a spreadsheet level until the data becomes complex enough that it can't really be fully modeled in a spreadsheet, or if I want other people to access this information kind of at the same time as me, and I want to have a little bit of control over the way that editing works. And so I thought it might be very useful to sit down and kind of go through what this data modeling process actually looks like in Python. Because if you look at this particular spreadsheet, you see that it looks pretty good, particularly when we're looking at texts that are derived from, say, the Kanseki repository. But as you get a little bit deeper into the spreadsheet, what you'll find is that things rapidly start to devolve. So for example, I have a bunch of texts from the OpenLit project. And in those cases, sometimes there is just extra information or too much information is crammed into a single column. And I need to come up with a way of actually kind of saving this in a sensible manner. So what we're going to do together today is do this. We're going to create our models with SQLAlchemy, and then we're going to generate a database out of this spreadsheet. Now, ideally in a later video, I'm going to put together something on Flask. And so we're going to kind of come together and build a front end for this database, because just having the database, while extremely valuable for your own purposes, often is not just sharing a SQLite or a MySQL database is not necessarily very user-friendly. And so if you have students or colleagues or friends who all want to kind of work on something together, it makes sense to have something that eases interaction with this database. But that's for a future video, and I don't know for sure if that's actually going to happen. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So I have an empty file here, and I'm going to use this to actually build out my data models. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be using this SQLAlchemy Python library. And this is essentially an ORM. This is an object relational mapper that lets you interact with a SQL database in a very Pythonic way. So essentially what we're able to do is we're able to take the data from our database and treat it as if it's a Python object. And this makes it much simpler to do analyses within Python itself, which is what most of the code on this channel has been focused on. So if you don't have this installed, it's quite simple to do so. All you need to do is you need to pip install SQLAlchemy. Now, when we get into Flask and we get into building interfaces for this, there is a Flask SQLAlchemy that's designed for use in Flask itself, but it's a little bit simplified from the full SQLAlchemy library, and I prefer just to build out our databases in SQLAlchemy itself. And so if you don't have this installed, all you really need to do is do pip install SQLAlchemy. Ideally, you would do this in a virtual environment so it doesn't kind of mess up the rest of your system installations, but for the sake of what I'm doing here, I'm just installing this directly for myself. And so then once you've installed this, you need to come over to your code, and I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm just going to call this bibliographic database.py. And I'm going to save it into a folder called database video alongside this metadata TSV, because what I want to do is I want to take this metadata and ingest it into my database. And I'm going to have to think very carefully about what that needs to look like. Now, as I think through my data model, and as I think through what sorts of tables I'm going to need in this database, I need to think a little bit about how bibliographic data ought to be organized. And there are a lot of, ideas about ideal ways of doing this. And of course, professionals have really done a great job of developing very detailed specifications for modeling bibliographic data. But for the sake of what we're working on, which is this kind of closed corpus and the associated metadata, I have a sense of how I want to represent this. So for example, I might think about all of the texts in this corpus as existing at a few different levels. There is perhaps an abstract level where we're thinking of something along the lines of a work. So the Zhou is a work. And this is kind of the book of changes as it existed in the Zhou dynasty. Maybe we also have Ming and Qing dynasty reprints and modern reprints. All of these things are works, and we kind of want to localize information about the work at that kind of upper abstract level. But alongside this, we also have editions. So there is an edition of the Zhou from the Zhou dynasty. I'm not actually sure if one really exists. I kind of doubt there's any extant versions from that early. But let's say if we're talking about the Journey to the West, that is a work. But there is a 1592 edition of the Journey to the West. There are later Ming and Qing editions. And so we then have editions of works. And then in a very practical level, or on a very practical level that I don't think we're going to be modeling in this video, we might also think about items. These are physical instantiations of these editions. So there is the 1592 edition, the copy of that exists in the National Palace Library, or the National Palace Museum. There is a copy of the Journey to the West that sits on my shelf. That's an item, okay? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be kind of thinking through what this should look like. And so inside this bibliographic database .py file, I'm going to start thinking through all of this. And I'm going to be largely following along with some of the tutorials that have been produced by the SQLAlchemy developers, because that's just a nice way of going about things. We're going to be following along essentially with how SQLAlchemy has put together this ORM Quick Start tutorial. And in this tutorial, it talks a lot about typing. It talks about kind of doing a declarative approach to data modeling. And that's basically what we're going to do, because that's what's expected these days. So in order to do this, we need to start loading in various things from SQLAlchemy that we're going to need to be using, and also from the typing library, which is part of the Python standard library. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import from typing a few things. I want list, and I also want optional, because I want to be able to tell my database that some of the things that we're going to be putting in these tables isn't required. That is, it's a nullable field. The next step is for me to import my SQLAlchemy data structures, the things that I need from SQLAlchemy. So I'm going to need from SQLAlchemy, I'm going to want string, because I'm going to have fields in my database that are strings. I want integers. I want foreign keys, and we'll talk about all of these things. I want table and column. There are a few other things that we're going to be using a little bit later when we think about making this more robust, and when it actually comes time to ingest data into our database. But for the moment, these are what we're going to need to design our data models. And then I also want from SQLAlchemy, I want the ORM. And I'm going to import declarative base, because this is kind of what's going to be the base class that's going to, form the foundation of all of our models. I want mapped, mapped column, and I want relationship. And so now what I can do is I can start building out the various classes that I need for my data model. Now, the standard thing to do here is for me to create a base class based on declarative base. And so here, I'm not actually going to put anything in this class. I'm just going to leave it as is. And so this is going to form the base for all of the models that we end up designing. Let's start coming up with the classes that we're going to need for our database. So I do want this sort of abstract class that's going to represent my works. And as I mentioned before, this might be the journey to the west, right? And so I would want to attach all of the additions of the journey to the west to this work model. I also want a class for my addition, right? And so here is where I'm going to attach all of the data related to the various additions that we're working with. I could model items also, but I think for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to leave these out because this kind of adds a little bit of complexity that's not really necessary for this specific database as it exists in, for us right now. One of the things that I want to keep track of for my works, for my additions, are people that are related to these things. So for example, I want to store author information. And so I might attach this to the work. And so I would have something along the lines of an author, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and just do this, and we'll come in and kind of define this. But the author, there's something important about this. One, not every text has a single author. So I want to make sure that I can store information about multiple people here. But I also want to design it in a way that I'm not having to change data across multiple places in my database. So for example, if we go into my metadata folder here, or my metadata file, and I look for somebody like Liu, what we see here is I have Liu kind of all over this file. And so I would want a single place to contain information about Liu such that if I had a typo somewhere in this spreadsheet, I wouldn't need to kind of check every single instance of Liu and edit it. So instead, I would want a reference to an ID in a different table that collects information about people, okay? So if we come back here, that means that I want a class for people. And I'm going to call this class person. And I'm going to say, okay, this is extends the base class. Okay. I want a few other things. So for example, I want to keep track of categorical information. And by that, I mean things like genre, for treasuries, classifications, subcategories, and all of these things, maybe LOC headers or LOC subject headers. There are all kinds of things that maybe I want to have associated with my works that this database ought to be keeping track of. Another piece of information in my metadata file here that's important for me is the corpus that the document comes from, right? I want to make sure I remember that because I do have different versions of a lot of these texts that come from different sources online, and I want to preserve that information. And so here I'm going to think about a table for information about the individual corpora. Okay. I also maybe want to keep track of when things were written. And in fact, this is definitely what I want to do. So I'm going to make a class for time periods. And then finally, I also might want to, I didn't want date there. I want base. I also might want to keep track of dates in a sort of complex fashion such that I don't need to ascribe a single date to every single one of my documents. Now, there are a lot of different ways we could approach this, but one thing that I'm always very interested in is when we look at editions, sometimes we only have a vague sense of when it was written. Maybe we know that it couldn't have been published before 1606, and it definitely was published before 1640. So we need to kind of think about ways of representing that time complexity in our database. And so there are ways we could do it. We could add different fields in, say, the edition class, where we say, okay, we have an early date, a late date, maybe an index year like the China Biographical Database uses. But I'd rather have a little bit more flexibility. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate model to keep track of date information. And this will hopefully make a little bit more sense as I start to actually do this data modeling process, as we start to link these different tables together. Okay? So I think that basically takes care of the general tables that I want to build now. Now I could, if I wanted to, spend more time really making this very sophisticated, think of more tables, but this is going to be, I think, pretty comprehensive for this particular database project. And so let's start thinking about what sorts of information we need to be tracking for each of these tables. So to start with, we're going to start with works. And so, it's always good practice to add commentary that kind of describes what all of these different things are going to be doing. And so for this table, I'm going to say that this is going to contain information describing abstract works. And so, for example, the journey to the west is an example of a work. Okay? Now, for SQLAlchemy, in this particular syntax, we're going to first need to define the table name for this particular data model. And here, I'm going to say this is works. So this table is going to be where all of the main data for the works that I am creating exist. I also need to specify an ID for for everything that gets put into this database. And so this is going to be an automatically generated number, and I'm just going to kind of have it iterate on integers. Now, the syntax here, as you'll see from the SQLAlchemy tutorial, looks like this. We have an ID, we have a mapped, and then we specified that this is going to be an integer. So this is basically a type checking mechanism. And then we say a mapped column and this is the primary key. Okay? And so here, I'm just going to do exactly what they did. I'm going to say mapped, and this is an integer. This basically says this is the data type that goes into this column. And then it's a mapped column, and again, primary key equals true. Now, one thing to note is that for all of these things, and this should be an equal sign and not a colon there, for all of the tables that we're creating, we need to do this exact same thing. So what I'm going to do, just to save myself a little bit of time, is I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to paste this into each of my other data models. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that work, so I can then just name this as we go along and try not to let it do the weird indentation thing here. And we'll come back and fill this out as we move along. And so we just want to make sure that all of these different tables have this data associated with them. Now that I've filled out this boilerplate, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and make sure I give all of my tables names, because I'm going to need these names as I start to make references between these different tables. And this is going to be an important thing as we move along. So here for addition, I think that a good table name here is additions. For items, I'm going to say items. Again, we're not really going to be using this table in this tutorial, but it's perhaps good to have it defined. The person table is going to be people. Category is categories. The corpus maybe is going to be corpora. The time period is going to be time periods. And then the date is going to be dates. Okay? And so now that I have these table names defined, I can actually go and make references across these different classes. Okay? So the first thing I think we ought to do is we ought to think about the kinds of information that are going to exist in all of these different tables. And maybe let's start by just thinking about these values before we start to actually provide the information that makes this happen. So the first thing I want to do is I want to, keep track of the title of my text, or the title of the work. So I could just say title and then define this, But a key thing here is I know that in my data set, every single one of these texts has a Chinese title, but it doesn't necessarily have a pinyin title provided or an English title. And I want to make sure I'm able to query my database along all of these different axes if I have the time to provide this data. So here, rather than just have title, I'm going to say title Chinese. I'm also going to say title English and title pinyin, just like this. And so here, and I need 3 dots here to make sure that I don't get any syntax errors. This is just a way of kind of trailing off, and we're going to come back and fill in this data, okay? So there are other things that I might want to keep track here. Well, maybe I want to keep track of the era in which a work was written, if I know that. And so maybe I'm going to say period of composition. And this is actually going to be a relationship to the time periods table, okay? And we'll come back and define that after we've thought through all of our different fields for these data models. I might also want to keep track of the date of composition. Now, I don't always know this, but in some cases I do. So date of composition. And again, this is going to be a relationship to dates. I also want to start to think about people who are associated with this particular document, right? So I want to maybe have an authors list, because remember, maybe there are multiple authors here. So I don't want to define this as a literal thing. So for example, up here on the title, this is going to be a literal string. That's not how you spell literal. And here we want, essentially, this should be a list of authors. And so this is going to be a separate kind of relational table in our database as we kind of actually use SQLAlchemy to create this. But that's just, we'll get there. So don't worry about that. I also want to keep track of the editions associated with this work, right? So again, Journey to the West, this is a work. Maybe the 1592 edition of Journey to the West is going to be in our editions table down here. I want to be able to associate these things. And so I also maybe want to keep track of categories, right? And here is where, this is going to be genre, subject matter, etc., right? So editions are specific editions of the work and so on, okay? Now, maybe as I go through and I think about this a little bit more, there's more information that might fit into this work table, but for the moment, I think we're going to leave it right there. So let's now come down to our edition table and start filling this out. So here, let's think about information associated with specific editions of works, okay? So maybe the 1592 edition of the Journey to the West, okay? And so now what I want to do is I want to start thinking about how these things exist in my spreadsheet, right? So here, this is kind of the literal information that exists inside this metadata spreadsheet, whereas the work is kind of an abstract concept. Here, these are all editions, right? This is a Zhou Dynasty edition of the Zhou, right? So what is the information that needs to be associated with this document at the edition level? Well, one thing I want to keep track of is this ID number from my personal research corpus, because that's just how I kind of reference these texts in all of the code that I write. So I might say this is my research ID, okay? And this is my own ID for a digital text in my corpus, okay? Now, I also, of course, want to keep track of the titles, right? And so here, this might be distinct from the work title, because sometimes editions actually have different titles than their works. Now, one thing that does mean is that when I automatically generate the work table with this spreadsheet, it's going to generate kind of works that are not necessarily meaningfully works. So I would need to go in and actually do a little bit of cleanup after the fact to make sure that works are associated with their proper editions and these kinds of things. So just be aware that the title of a edition can actually be distinct from the title of a work. And of course, I also want title pinyin and I want title English. Now, here again, I also want to think about maybe when this particular edition was published, right? So here, maybe I'll say period of publication, right? So I want to keep track of the period of publication, maybe the date of publication. I also want to keep track, again, of people associated with this. So, for example, I want publishers. If I have that information, I want editors. I want commentators. Commentators? Like that? That might be misspelled, but that's okay. We'll fix that later. Another thing we would want to keep track of for these particular editions is the character set that they use. So one thing that I have noted in my metadata file is, are these in traditional characters or simplified characters? Because a lot of these texts come from different places online. This can be different depending on the particular text you're working with. And so I want to actually keep track of that information. And so I'm going to say character set. And this is going to be either traditional or simplified. So what else do I need to think about here? Well, I need to think about the works that are associated with this edition. And if you remember up here, when I'm looking at my works table, I also have an editions field, right? And so this editions field is going to be linked through my database logic to this works field, right? And this is the relational part of the relational database. And so these two fields need to be kind of synced in a way. And I'm going to show you how to do that once we get through kind of thinking about all of the information we're going to need to make this work. I also want to make sure that I am keeping track of the corpus that this document is from. And I also want the origin corpus ID, because I want to make sure I'm keeping track of how the original corpus refers to a document. So, for example, the Kanseki repository refers to the Joe as KR1A0001, right? And I just want to make sure I'm preserving that information. And because my spreadsheet has a notes field in it at the very, very end, I'm going to keep track of that. Now, ideally, all of my different models would contain a notes field, but for the moment, we're just going to leave this as is. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the items table because I'm not going to deal with that. Let's think about the person table now. In this particular case, and I could add a little bit of commentary here to note what this class is focused on. And this is going to contain information about people. These could be authors, editors, commentators, publishers, etc., right? It could be any number of different people. And so here I have, of course, their ID. Then I maybe want their name in Chinese because, again, the people in this particular database are all Chinese people. Now, I might be a little bit more flexible in this case if I knew I was going to be including people who weren't Chinese or who didn't have Chinese names. But, for the moment, this is just how I'm going to design it. And I also maybe want to keep track of their name in pinyin because that's just easier for some people to deal with. So I might want to, in this particular table, keep track of information, or in this model at least, keep track of information on what books did they write, what books did they edit, what did they publish, and what did they comment on, and all of these different things. I'm going to say I want an authored works field, maybe an edited works field. I want a published editions, and actually I think edited editions would be better. Because I think of authorship existing on the level of the work and editing existing on the level of the edition, although I think this is debatable. And, we could have a discussion either in the comments or, on Blue Sky or in some other forum about the best way of representing these things. This is, of course, all for demonstration purposes. You would want to be thinking very seriously about what all of these data models should look like if you wanted to do this for yourself. And I encourage you to do this. We also maybe want commentated additions. Okay? The other thing we might want to keep track of is some sort of naming authority or kind of external resource that describes biographical information. And my go-to for this for Chinese, in particular pre-modern Chinese, is the China Biographical Database, or the CBDB. And so in this database, I'm just going to keep track of their CBDB ID. Now, if I wanted to be kind of sophisticated about this, maybe I would want to allow for multiple naming authorities. So there's a spectacular Buddhist naming authority that would be useful if I'm talking about Buddhist monks and these sorts of things. But for the moment, we're just going to do CBDB ID. Let's think about now categories. So here, this category table is going to contain information on bibliographic categories. And this could be genre, LOC, subject headings, for treasuries, classification, and I realize I have a typo here, but it's not that big of a deal, and so on, right? And so this is categories, and so now what I want to do is I want to set this up. So I want the category itself, and maybe I'll say category is going to be in Chinese, and I also want the category in pinyin and maybe the category in English. And this is going to be what actually contains the category information. So if we look, for example, in our metadata file here, we see that the for branches classification here is a Jing, or this is a classic, right? And so that's going to be the data that gets stored in this category ZH, and then maybe I would provide the pinyin and an English translation, okay? Now, I also want to keep track of the type of category. And here is where this is going to be, is this for treasuries, a LOC heading, subject heading, etc., right? Because I want to make sure that when I say this is a Jing, I want to specify where this idea comes from. Now, I also want to be able to, from the category, fetch a list of all of the works that belong to that category. So I'm going to make sure we have a reference to that here. For the corpus, we're going to do a similar thing. This is going to be information on external corpora. And so, for example, I got data here from the Kanseki repository, from Daizhige, from Wikisource, OpenLit, maybe Project Gutenberg, etc. Okay? And so here, what I want to do is I want to specify the name of the corpus. And here I don't need Chinese, English, or pinyin. I'll just define the name. I also want a URL. Where can I go to find this corpus online? I'm also going to keep track of the editions present in that corpus. So here I want to ask my database for this corpus, what editions does it contain? So now let's talk about time period. Here, I'll do time period again, we want Chinese, pinyin, and English. Here, we also want references to the works and references to the editions. So I'm making sure that these tables contain these references such that I can easily do queries from the time period to the works and editions themselves. Let's go ahead and fill out what we might want for the date as well. I might also want to keep track of the Chinese style date. So this would be a reference to, say, a rain date and the year within that rain, these kinds of things. So I also want to keep track of the date type. And for me, this is going to be, is this an exact date? Is it an earliest possible date? Latest possible date? And then maybe I want to keep track of the precision reason, maybe. And so, for example, why do I know this date info? So maybe it's contained in like the preface, or maybe it's just an estimate based on the author's life, these kinds of things. This information is actually not contained in my spreadsheet, but I do keep track of it in other spreadsheets, and I want to be sure that I integrate this later.